wrote a report in July 2006, a second version January 2007, a third version in book form under the title Bloody Harvest, November 2009, a book, a collection of essays that came out in August 2012. So there's a lot of material. The two reports are posted on the internet, and the books are available through, it can be purchased. And obviously in the few minutes, it's impossible to sort of give you the wealth of detail that supports the conclusions. But let me just say a few things about that. One is the telephone calls. We had callers calling into China, investigators, pretending to be relatives of patients needing transplants, and asking the hospitals if they had organs of Falun Gong practitioners for sale. And we got admissions throughout out China. Yes, we do. The reason the callers indicated they were calling was that Falun Gong is a set of exercises. The practitioners are healthy, their organs are going to be healthy, and the callers were pretending to be relatives of patients that needed these organs. So we got admissions throughout China, taped, transcribed, translated, saying, yes, Falun Gong organs for sale. Now, the Chinese government did a documentary responding to our report, and in that report, they interviewed a couple people that we called. One of them was Lu Guoping. So they present Lu Guoping a transcript of the call, and he says, yes, I got the call, and yes, I said most of these things, but the stuff here and there about Falun Gong, I didn't say, accusing us basically of fiddling with the transcript. But there's no acknowledgement that we have him on tape, and no explanation of how we possibly could have interwoven seamlessly what he, in his own voice, what he denies having said and what he admits having said. Yet for the Chinese people, all they would see is this propaganda documentary, and certainly not our report or our website, which is blocked in China. So that's one piece of evidence. A second piece of evidence is blood testing. We found that Falun Gong practitioners who got out of prison and not out of China told us systematically they were blood tested and organ examined, and it wasn't for their health because they were being tortured, but it is necessary for organ transplants because you need blood type compatibility and ideally tissue type compatibility as well. The people who got out of prison who were not Falun Gong practitioners told us the same thing, that the people they saw in prison who were Falun Gong practitioners were going through these tests, and they were not. And we found this. We found practitioners around the world telling us this, and it wasn't the matter that was of immediate concern or interest to them because they weren't harmed by the blood testing. In fact, what they wanted to talk about was their torture, and it took a while to sort of find out from each of them by talking to them that this was systematically happening. And of course, these people didn't know each other, hadn't talked to each other, and yet we found this pretty regularly everywhere. And so that's a second factor. A third factor is the numbers. China, in terms of transplant volumes, is number one in the world after the United States. Waiting times are very short, whereas everywhere else they're very long. And China, until this year, didn't have a donation system. Where are the organs coming from? Well, the Chinese government says prisoners sentenced to death. Well, what's the death penalty numbers? They won't tell you. We do know that they've been going down over time because they've changed the procedures to centralize death penalty from regional courts to Supreme Court. They've cut down the number of death penalty offenses, but transplant volumes have remained constant. There's no national organ donation system. There's a huge amount of hepatitis in the prison system, which makes a lot of the organs unusable. And we estimate that about, in order to supply 10,000 organs a year, there'd have to be death penalty volumes of about 50,000 a year. And the highest estimates of death penalty volumes in China are about a tenth of that. So there is no explanation other than the one we've come up with, the Falun Gong prisoners. The Falun Gong prisoners, they represent a huge population within the Chinese system in the hundreds of thousands. They don't self-identify to protect their immediate family, which means that the relatives don't know where they are, and the jailers don't know who they are, so they're extremely vulnerable. They are subject to extreme vilification through hate propaganda, which means that they're depersonalized and dehumanized and marginalized. So we have this very vulnerable population. The last factor I'll mention here, although there's much more one could get into, but it's relevant to the jurisdiction of the Scottish Parliament, is that as we look around the world and in China about the precautions that should be put in place to prevent this abuse from happening, they're not there, neither in China nor elsewhere. We don't have in China, obviously, one can see that if one knows the system in China, we don't have the rule of law. When we started, the law itself didn't require consent from prisoners for sourcing from organs. They did change that, but there's no way of enforcing that. There's no traceability. There's no records. There's no access to records, so there's no way of determining whether there's consent, even if they assert there's consent. So we don't have the system in place in China to prevent it, and we don't have the system in place abroad to prevent transplant tourists from going into China and participating in organ transplant abuse. There are some legislative proposals in some countries to deal with it. Israel enacted a law to that effect. And it's something the Scottish Parliament could do. Health is a devolved domain. It's not a reserved domain. The Scottish Parliament, in its devolved domain, can enact extraterritorial legislation, and it's done so for female genital mutilation. So it already has legislation about organ transplant abuse called the Human Tissue Scotland Act, which it could simply amend to encompass a foreign transplant abuse. And it would send a message, it would be an example, it would help to establish a network to prevent this sort of abuse. So those are my very brief remarks. Thank you very much.